Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Nazi Seizure of Power, the experience of a single German town, 1922 to 1945, revised edition, by William Sheridan Allen, narrated by Tom Beyer. Publisher's note: this audiobook contains references to material present in the print and ebook editions of the book. Preface to the first edition. This is a history of a single small town in Germany during the last years of the Weimar Republic and the first years of the Third Reich. It is an attempt to understand one of the central political and moral problems of the 20th century: how a civilized democracy could be plunged into a nihilistic dictatorship. I chose to approach this problem by studying a single town, partly because no close study of the local aspects of the Nazi Revolution existed. A book has been written on the state of Brunswick's Nazi conservative coalition, and another on the Nazification of the Schleswig-Holstein provinces, both halting before the actual seizure of power. But before I undertook this present study, there was nothing written to cover the entire period of the Nazi Revolution or that focused on a limited locality. Yet Nazi measures on the local level were a key to the establishment of the Third Reich in Germany. Before Hitler came to power, he gained great support through the virtuosity and adaptability of his local party organizations. The actual seizure of power in the spring of 1933 occurred largely from below, though it was facilitated and made possible by Hitler's position as Chancellor of Germany. The Führer reached the pinnacle of power because his followers were successful at the lowest level, at the base. A single unit can never adequately reflect the whole. The subject of this book was not, in many ways, an average German town. It was heavily middle class. It was more closely tied to the countryside and less to industry than most German towns. It was overwhelmingly Lutheran. It turned to Nazism earlier and more strongly than most of the rest of Germany. Yet it does show representative characteristics in the activism of the Nazi Party, in the sociological strengths and weaknesses of the Social Democrats, in the attitudes of the nationalistic middle class, in voting trends, in the growth of political activity and partisan violence, and perhaps in other ways that will become apparent only when other towns are studied in similar detail. In this sense, it is not a true microcosm, though it can be instructive of broader trends. I offer it as at least one concrete example of what the Nazi Revolution meant in all its varied aspects in one confined area. If a microcosm has the drawback of being non-representative, it has the advantage of permitting a close and detailed study. The smaller number of actors makes it possible for the historian to come near to knowing them all. Variables are limited, and there is a comprehensible and relatively constant background. Immediacy and reality are enhanced. One can fit actions into the pattern of daily life and thus determine why individuals acted as they did, why Germans made the kind of choices that let Hitler into power. It was this possibility more than anything else that led me to research into the fate of a town which would otherwise not deserve even a footnote in a general study of the rise of Nazism. The ravages of revolution, terror, war, and occupation severely limited the number and type of source materials available for this study. Thanks to the cooperation of the townspeople, however, most of the public and private documents that survived were put at my disposal. Enough of the people of the town agreed to be interviewed so that I was able to interrogate most leading figures and also obtain an acceptable general cross-section. Their recollections and impressions were then checked against the contemporary documents and newspaper accounts. The result was a considerable collection of detail, much of which had to be omitted from this book, but which is to be found in my doctoral dissertation. Small towns the world over have two aspects in common: little privacy and much gossip. Before I ever began my research, I came to the conclusion that not only should the names of informants and other principal characters be kept secret, but the actual name of the town would have to be disguised. Consequently, anyone who looks on a map or in an encyclopedia for Talburg will not find it. This precaution was also part of a promise which I made to the city fathers and to all those interviewed. Scholars who want to pursue the matter will find the identity of the town, plus a list and identification of sources on file at the History Department of the University of Minnesota. There is a descriptive list of persons interviewed in the appendix, which can be found in the print and e-book versions of this book. No person from Talburg mentioned in this study has been given his true name. Inventing so many names taxes the imagination. Should any listener find his name in this book, I hope he will understand that it is pure coincidence. W.S.A., Columbia, Missouri, 1965. Preface to the Revised Edition. When my publisher first suggested that I revise this book in time to mark the 50th anniversary of Hitler's seizure of power in Germany, I had some doubts. It seemed to me that, as it stood, the book had worn well. Reviewers had been very positive about it, none of its major interpretations had been seriously questioned, and its methodology was accepted as valid and emulated by numerous scholars. Most satisfying to me as a teacher was that the book proved useful for undergraduate courses. In fact, it has become, over the past 17 years, the most widely assigned book in German history classes in America. Largely, I think, because students feel unintimidated by the prospect of trying to understand one town rather than an entire nation. What may appear impossibly complex as a problem involving 60 million people seems more comprehensible in a small community, even if most of the same elements of complexity are there, or so many American students have felt. In short, I accepted the wisdom of the old adage, if it isn't broken, don't fix it. Also, I doubted that I could find enough new information to justify a revision. Not that new things have not become known about the rise of Nazism in general, but the whole point of a microcosmic study is to limit it to what can be established about a particular confined locality. And so, while it is valid to use the insights developed from other studies, it would not be proper to borrow their information. Much comparable data has come from other local studies since 1965, so that it might be instructive to discuss the various findings from different German towns. But we all seem to have reached the same major conclusions. An exhaustive analysis of the fine shadings produced by microcosmic research on Nazism would make a good review article for a scholarly journal, but probably not an interesting book for the general listener. The publication in 1971 of an extremely instructive regional study of the Nazi organization directly above that which I had analyzed made me want to meld its findings with mine. But to do this adequately, I would have needed new information at my level to match its data. Since I was convinced that I had exhausted all the available documentary records at the time of my original research, and since no new discoveries had been announced in the interim, I did not believe that there was any new material. What was to happen constitutes, therefore, a cautionary tale for historical researchers. Nevertheless, I took the occasion of a research trip to Germany in 1979 to investigate whether there was any new data on the rise of Nazism in Northeim, the town that was the subject of my original study. I went through the governmental and party records at the Federal Archives in Koblenz, the Prussian Privy State Archives in Berlin-Dahlem, and the Berlin Document Center. In each depository, I found a few interesting but minor bits of information. What I really needed were the actual files of the Nazi Party of Northeim, and those, I had been told long ago, were burned at the collapse of the Third Reich. However, as other scholars had long since discovered, the records of the Nazi district to which Northeim belonged, Gau, South Hanover, Brunswick, were largely intact. In the Nazi Party's organizational structure, Germany was divided into some 35 districts, each called a Gau. Each Gauleiter, or Nazi district leader, was responsible for the local groups within his region, and thus I hoped to find correspondence between local group Northeim and the Gauleitung of South Hanover, Brunswick. If there were any such letters, they would be in the State Archives of Lower Saxony in Hanover. In Hanover, the archivist rapidly detailed the files where I might find letters between Northeim and its Gauleitung, and then said he also had some other documents from Northeim that might interest me. They had never been catalogued, had never even been assigned archival numbers, had never been seen by other researchers, and would fill about 8 large wash baskets. This new material turned out to be carbon copies of the correspondence of the Nazi Party of local group Northeim, 1929 to 1938. There were also other items reaching into the early 1940s, including about 1,000 evaluations of the political reliability of individual persons from Northeim, with an archivist's penciled notation on the cover, "Not very interesting." All this had been transferred to the Gau archives during World War II, had been more or less buried as being inconsequential, and had thus escaped the fate of the originals of Northeim's Nazi records at the end of the war. Clearly, this was the material that would not only justify, but would require a revision of the Nazi seizure of power. Analysis of these documents showed that most of them confirmed rather than contradicted my original conclusions. But they also supplied extensive additional data on the inner workings of the Nazi Party in the town, on its financing and propaganda techniques, on the control methods it used to exercise power over the townspeople during the Third Reich, on the extent of the assistance and direction given to the local Nazis by the party's regional and national offices. There was enough material on the early history of Nazism in Northeim, 1922 to 1929, and on the period 1935 to 1945, so that I could add several new sections to the book, and could also extend its parameters to cover the town's whole experience of Nazism, from the beginning to the end. Some of this material has already enabled me to contribute to the debate over theories about the nature of Hitler's regime. Other data is valuable mainly for the specific details it provides about the day-to-day doings of the Nazis. It should help students understand that the rise of the Nazis to power, with all that that implies and led to, was not some mysterious plague that could creep up again with little warning. Analyzed in detail, the Nazi victory is quite explicable as a consequence of clever but comprehensible techniques, under conditions that were terribly conducive to their success, but which are also avoidable. Knowing how it happened once can arm us all against letting something similar happen again, which was what led me to write this book in the first place. Listeners familiar with the first edition will find one other major difference in this revision. In the first edition, I tried to protect the privacy of the townspeople by referring to their city pseudonymously as Talburg. Reviewers in America and England, who undoubtedly identified the actual town easily enough as any specialist in German history could, respected my attempt. But the West German magazine Der Spiegel exposed the secret shortly after the German translation appeared, and for good measure also identified most of the individuals mentioned in my book. So there is no longer any reason not to use the name of Northeim, and since many of the persons mentioned in the first edition have since died, I have used their real names too. Others, to whom I promised anonymity, and who were not listed in the Spiegel article, will continue to be identified by pseudonyms. Additionally, I have integrated my original sources with full identification into the footnotes which can be found in the print and ebook versions of this book for the use of future researchers. W.S.A. Buffalo, New York, 1983. Part 1. The Death of Democracy, 1922 to January 1933. 1. The setting. Drink and eat. Forget not God. Protect your honor. No one will ask more of you than that. Medieval inscription on the Northeim house. If you open an atlas to the map of Central Europe and put your thumb down on the center of pre-war Germany, the chances are good that you will land on Northeim, a town in the former Kingdom of Hanover. In the days of the Weimar Republic, it was still a small town, with a population of about 10,000. There were close to 1,000 towns of this size in Germany then. About 1 of every 7 Germans lived in them. In 1930, Northeim was the kind of town that English tourists were fond of discovering. Provincial and off the beaten track, semi-medieval, set in quiet and pleasant surroundings. It nestled against one of the many low wooded foothills that frame the valley of the Leine River. Since the valley was only a few miles wide and very flat, a person standing in the slanting fields above Northeim could see across to the hills on the other side. It gave the town a sense of being snug, enclosed, protected from the outer world. The placid Leine River was joined at Northeim by a smaller river, the Rhume, which had carved out a narrow valley immediately north of the town. The confluence of the rivers and their valleys created the town, for from the days of the Hanseatic traders this place had been a minor east-west north-south junction point. From the hills above the town in 1930, you could see the main railroad line stretching up and down the Leine River Valley toward Munich or Hamburg, just touching against the perimeter of Northeim, and the spur line swinging around the city walls to follow the Ruma Valley toward Berlin. There actually were walls around part of the town. They enclosed the medieval inner core of Northeim. Here, within an oval about 600 yards long, was a neat but imprecise jumble of half-timbered houses with steep red-tiled roofs along winding cobblestone streets. One street that ran through the town was 3 lanes wide, and therefore called Broad Street, the main commercial avenue with shops in every house. In the middle of the town was a large square, used for the weekly produce market and also suitable for open-air mass meetings. The only other clear areas within the walls were a small war memorial on one side of Broad Street, a small space in front of the town hall, and another in front of the great 16th-century Lutheran church. The rest of the inner town was filled with narrow streets, with houses built to the very edges, jammed side by side, the front of each decorated with timbered beams of various geometric patterns, the upper stories marked by irregular small-paned windows, the whole surmounted by steep roofs in a skyline diversified by angular gables and chimneys. There were over 500 houses in the old part of Northeim. Almost half of the townspeople lived there. Outside the medieval oval were various residential areas, built mainly in the period from 1870 to 1914. The most desirable district was on the hillside above the old town. There one found large one-family dwellings, schools, broad asphalt streets, spacious lawns, shade trees, and shrubbery. From these houses there was a good view of town and valley, and the summer breezes kept this area cooler than the rest of Northeim. Here dwelt the town's upper class. On the other side of the medieval section, across the spur line of the railroad, was the Ruma Canal, dug in the Middle Ages to power a grain mill. This narrow strip of water created an island closed off by the Ruma River. There were apartment houses, small dwellings, and a large circus grounds on it. At one corner of the circus grounds was a large meeting hall called the 1900 Zelt, suitable for dances, festivals, and mass meetings. A bridge called the Long Bridge spanned the Ruma River. On the other side lay a former army compound, backed up against foothills. In 1930, the compound housed a variety of state houses, including the employment office, a factory, emergency low-rent dwellings, and a youth hostel. On the side of the town toward the Leine River were nondescript residential dwellings, a few industrial plants, and a sugar beet refinery whose ugly smokestacks spoiled the skyline, and the railroad station with extensive yards and maintenance buildings. Thus, around the old inner city were 3 areas where the town had expanded, up the hill and toward each of the 2 rivers, 1 district for the rich and 2 for the lower classes. But the center and essence of Northeim remained the old medieval city surrounded by the slowly crumbling walls. The history of the town, like its physical setting, showed an interplay between isolation and involvement. Northeim was founded in the time of Charlemagne, but from then to the 13th century it was little more than a blockhouse, a monastery, and an appended village. In those early days, Northeim enjoyed some moments of national eminence, for one of its counts was a military leader strong enough to do battle with the Holy Roman Emperor himself, though with disastrous results to his own family's fortunes. The future of the town lay in more prosaic areas of endeavor. Beginning in the 12th century, merchants settled before the monastery walls, and it was under their leadership that Northeim was granted a city charter by the Guelph dukes in 1252. In subsequent years, the town grew rapidly. A town wall was built with battlements, towers, and moat. Immigration swelled the population. The Ruma Canal was dug, and Northeim joined the Hanseatic League. By the 15th century, the town was almost completely independent of the Guelph dukes and even coined its own money. This was the period of Northeim's flowering. An ancient engraving shows it to be one of the richer and larger cities of that era. The period of medieval splendor and independence for Northeim came to an end with the 30 Years' War. The town had become Lutheran during the Reformation, and when it was ordered to open its gates to the Catholic army under Tilly, the city council refused. A bitter 2-year siege followed. Within Northeim, there was an intense factional fight. The upper classes favored surrender, while the lower classes chose to resist the Catholic army. In 1627, the Peace Party turned the town over to General Tilly, who punished Northeim severely for its former resistance. Northeim emerged from the 30 Years' War small and weak, the shadow of its former strength. It had been occupied by both sides, beleaguered, plundered, and burned. In 1648, over 300 houses were empty, and only about 700 inhabitants were left in the town. The Duke had revoked its rights, stripped away all vestiges of independence, and placed a permanent garrison in the town to intimidate the burghers. Recovery came very slowly. It was not until the time of the French Revolution that Northeim regained the number of inhabitants it had had in the 14th century, about 2,500. Though the merchants still predominated, economically and politically, the town had become only a local market center, exchanging handicraft products for agricultural ones. It was not until 1817 that the first house was built outside the city walls. The main line railroad was built through Northeim in 1857, and 10 years later, the east-west line through the mountains turned the town into an important traffic point. Now, government offices began to find it a convenient location. The former Kingdom of Hanover was incorporated into Prussia, bringing new uniforms to the garrison troops and laying the basis for more rapid development. By the 1870s, the town had acquired a variety of technical academies and college preparatory schools. In 1886, it was named a county capital. Railroad maintenance shops were built, and several small factories were founded. The town acquired a working class who brought with them the new doctrines of Karl Marx. Owing to the influx of teachers, artisans, government officials, and railroad personnel, a Catholic church could be opened in Northeim. Those thin iron rails had brought the outer world with them. The last vestige of medieval ways ended in 1900, when a sewage system was introduced. Prior to that, Northeim had cleaned its streets by opening the upper moat every Saturday. The waters would flow down the slight incline, coursing over the cobblestones toward the Ruma Canal, and housewives or maids would follow with their brush brooms. The new sewage system was expensive, But the Germany of Kaiser Wilhelm II was prosperous and required symbols of prosperity. In Northeim, a fountain was built on the market square with a copper statue of the ancient.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?